Welcome to episode 6 of the new Athletic Supporters. And the gang's all here now again because Kim pitched a beautiful game last week. He took it on the chin for a while, but then he got back up on the mound and the team pulled out a victory. Kim, do you want to rehash just a little bit on what happened last week?
We scored 9 runs in the last 2 innings, and I struck out a young stud to end it.
Yeah.
It's a great feeling when you're my age.
A great feeling to strike out a stud once you've gotten on the mound.
That's it.
Well done, Kim. Well done.
Yeah, way to go, Kim.
So, Kim, since you were away last week, why don't you get us kicked off with whatever it is that's on your mind?
I just want to talk about the Leafs briefly and offer a heartfelt thanks to the Leafs. It was just an incredible season, the best season in 30 years. It sucked me back into hockey like a hurricane. I became not quite Shea level, but not too far away from Shea level, passionate about it. And I love that. And it's sad, obviously, that they couldn't persevere against Tampa. Given what we just witnessed, the way Tampa dispatched Florida, the President's Cup winners in 4 straight, it really says a lot about how the Leafs pushed Tampa literally to the brink. Not quite, not over, but that's a dynastic team, and you really have to admire what they're all about. And I just wanted to say thank you to the Leafs for that, and I look forward to the off-season tweaking and take another run next year.
Well said. Very nice.
I wonder if any of the Leafs are listening to our podcast.
I'm sure they all are, Steve. Why wouldn't they?
Well, I can't think of a reason why they wouldn't unless they've all gone on vacation. And even if just a few of them are listening, it would be nice if they could pass on Kim's thanks to the rest of the team, perhaps in a text group.
That's a great idea. You've got some contacts. Can you make that happen?
I'll see what I can do. Jeez.
Actually, you know that now that I think about it, Kev, you're going to be at the Hockey Hall of Fame induction ceremony soon, right?
Not until November.
Oh, it's in November.
Yeah, they're going to announce it in a couple of weeks' time.
Do you think that you could slip in a link to this podcast when they make the announcement?
I don't know that that's going to work, but I could certainly.
I don't know that it's not going to work.
There we
are. Guys, let's show what we're made of this week. We read books. We watch films, not movies. We go to the cinema. Let's talk about sports in books, sports in movies. What are some of your favorite? Actually, let's talk about what are some of your favorite sports books, and what makes sports writing exciting to you?
The first book I ever read was when I was a child. I want to say 10 or 11 or something. A book on Gordie Howe. And I don't know why I read a book on Gordie Howe, other than it might have been the only book around in those days. The only thing I remember about it was it had a shot of him fishing in the summertime with his shirt off, and he was ripped like you wouldn't freaking believe. Oh my God. But other than that, that's the only thing that stuck with me was that picture of him sitting there with holding the fishing rod and without his shirt on, and that it was about him. But one of the things I found as I thought about this, what books have I loved about sports? And generally, two of the, I've brought out 3. I'm going to talk about 2 of the 3 have been great stories. The third one is a book I know Kevin's read because he borrowed it, Lions in Winter, a classic story of the history of the Canadiens. Really great book if you want to learn about all of the history and all the great players and all the success they've had and things like that. But the 2 books that stick out for me as great reads and they're great stories. One was called A Season on the Brink, about Indiana University and Bobby Knight going from training camp all the way to the NCAA basketball tournament, ultimately making right deep into the tournament. A great story. Bobby Knight's a larger than life character. Indiana is one of the true great basketball schools in the US. But to follow that story and watch as they build towards the tournament, going through all the small tournaments they play in, the league championship they go through, it's a heck of a story. And you, like I said, you add this character of Bobby Knight as a coach to add a whole other level to it. The other book that has stuck with me all these years is one called Final Rounds: A Father, a Son, the Golf Journey of a Lifetime. And it's a lovely story of a father and son doing a 2-month, 3-month golf trip, playing some of the classic courses in the UK, Carnoustie, and I've just drawn a blank, boy. Poof. But it's just a lovely story about a father and a son together playing a game that, as Tim knows, I love. I'm not very good at it, but I love it as a game. I love the camaraderie of it. To be outside playing with people that you love hanging with, which is how I've generally played the game, but also just the thought, and reading this book, because I read it after my father had passed, how I wish that he and I had done it as golfers. We played some scruff golf on the fairway across the street from my mother's father's house in St. Andrews, and would be down there. We had some old wooden clubs from my grandfather, who was born in 1889. So you can imagine how old he was when he bought those clubs. But yeah, my dad and I, I only took up golf after my dad had passed and really got into it. And it's a real shame, because it's such a great game. And the story of a father and son playing these rounds together in these classic courses, and just the sharing that they do, it's really lovely.
It's funny. The reason I brought it up is because I thought that I want to talk a little bit about what makes great sports writing. And I mean, I have a whole slew of books here that I really, really enjoy, some of which I love. And the common thread for the ones that I like the most are the ones that are based in reality, but read like fantasy. The writers use language in such a way that it doesn't actually matter whether or not it's a real story, that it would work even if it was fiction.
Kim, why don't you jump in for a second and bring us up to speed on the author that we lost this past week, the baseball writer, because he wrote so beautifully, and it's exactly what Steve was talking about at that the last moment or two.
Thanks, Kev. I was having a similar thought. This week we lost Roger Angel at the age of 101, who wrote about baseball like a poet. He was just an incredibly fluid prose writer. He came from prose royalty, as many of the write-ups about him mentioned, and started writing about baseball in the early 60s when he was still a young man. And only a few years ago was voted into the writers' wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame. Just a tremendous, tremendous author.
Yeah, agreed. A big loss for the sport, and for all sports too. So I started off falling in love with baseball books, which is odd because I was a baseball fan, no doubt, but I was much more of a hockey fan. But I guess it was at the local library. Hockey books weren't that prevalent at the time, and so I just was always a voracious reader. And I started off reading books that were about baseball. So It's Good to Be Alive by Roy Campanella is one that I remember. And as we talked about just a few moments ago, just great stories. Campanella was an amazing baseball player, most valuable player, etc., but who got into a really awful car accident and became a quadriplegic. And here I am, probably 9 or 10 years old, reading books like that, but it really engaged me at the time and got me that much more involved in sports books. And then at Christmas, I don't know what age I would have been, but there was I'll call it a triumvirate of releases by Scott Young, the sports writer and Neil Young's father. And although they were written in previous years, I thought they all came out at the same time. And that's the way I received them that year. And it was Boy on Defense, Scrubs on Skates, and A Boy at the Leafs Camp. And they were all fiction, which isn't something I necessarily read, although at the time I wouldn't have known any different. But they were great books, and just ate them up with a spoon. They were just such great books about my favorite sport by an author who I learned to love and got a chance to spend some time with much later on too. And then if I can keep it personal for a moment, when my dad realized I loved books so much, he pulled out his collection of books, and they were nothing special, candidly, but they were books that he would have bought. They were pulp paperbacks, all about the Leafs, the Gas House Gang of hockey about the Leafs of the 30s, and Max Bentley, hockey's Dipsy Doodle Dandy, and Turk Broda of the Leafs, and Come On Teeter, all books about the Leafs that came out in the early 1950s. And I treasure them. They were very average books written by a guy named Ed Fitkin, one of the first hockey authors who really got into it. He was expecting to make millions of dollars by putting these out. There were others as well, but those were the ones. But because Dad gave them to me, and they're some of the earliest books I had, I treasure them to this moment now. They're very valuable books just because they're old, and pulp paperbacks don't keep very easily, but they're very special to me for a different reason. Sorry, I'm going on and on, but I'm just going to mention one book that I think is probably my favorite hockey book. And it's not one that most people would expect. You know, it's not Ken Dryden the Game, or it's not, whatever it happens to be. But it's a kid's book. It's Roch Carrier's The Sweater. And I just think it's so wonderful in its storytelling and its writing. We've seen the video as well with his I wouldn't say patois by any means, but his very heavily accented reading of the book as well. And it just talks about the passion that a little boy has for his Montreal Canadiens, and how he's so distraught when Mom orders him a hockey sweater and Mr. Eaton in Toronto sends a Toronto Maple Leaf one by mistake. And it's my favorite hockey book for sure. So some of my thoughts, mostly all kind of close to home and close to my chest as well.
Kev, I'm actually curious. I mean, as an author now, even going back, is there a voice that you try to write in that's particular, that might be influenced by writings that you've read in the past?
Oh, interesting question. There is. If I'm writing somebody's autobiography as the not quite so ghostly writer, I try and capture their voice by interviewing them incessantly and trying to capture just their ebbs and flows of conversation. But when I'm writing for myself, I definitely have a voice in my head that I try and capture, and I study every word. I wish I was as wonderful a writer as Roger Angell, for example. I think about the sports writers of the 1940s who used words so beautifully and had such great expressions, and I labor over mine. They come off in my own way, but I definitely have a voice I try to capture, and I labor over it and go over every sentence over and over again, and finally get it just the way that I want it to feel, and I want it to feel as though it's coming from my lips as well. So yeah, there definitely is a voice that I try to capture.
It's funny that you talk about the writers from the 40s, because I years ago bought a collection of Ring Lardner essays in hopes of trying to understand what made him a great writer. And it's just so funny that his writing is so particular to that era, that you really have to accept that there is a language that is so different, and just really absorb it and accept it. And you have to be ready to, you really have to be ready to let it into your intellect, because it is so different than what we know of as modern writing.
Well, sort of just to finish off to that point, I just think, so back then there were columnists, and they were part of the team. They traveled with the team. They had all the insights of the team they were covering at the time. They were able to move forward that way, and so they had a different relationship entirely. And I think they had a little bit more time to write. Today's sports writers really are just up against a deadline, and they're bagging off the stories. We see Rosie DiMano in the Toronto Star as as a bit of a throwback to the ones that we're talking about. She writes beautifully and has great eloquence and a great vocabulary in her writing too. But for the most part, it's get the story out there, get the interview, let's get it out there and move forward. They don't have the luxury of being able to luxuriate over the prose on their page, as it were.
Tim, you got something?
Sorry, Steve?
Do you have something that you've read that you particularly?
Yeah. There's a couple that have stood out to me. I've read almost countless books about motor racing, but the thing that captures me personally, it's a very personal thing, I guess, is stories and biographies and understanding the heroes of the 50s, really, the 50s, maybe the early 60s. And I think it's about learning something about things that I just, that I don't have enough knowledge of or have never experienced myself, haven't seen it. So trying to understand more about what that was like. And there's a particular book. I mean, I've read several about the people who drove in that time. There's a particular book called Mon Ami Mate, and it's a double biography, really. It's about Mike Hawthorne and Peter Collins, who are two British drivers in the 50s, and both dead now. Both died young, as drivers tended to do in those days. There would often be 2 or 3 deaths a year in frontline racing. And these two were great friends, and they each called the other one Mon Ami Mate, which I think came from a strip cartoon or something like that, but it was a little pet name they called each other. And they raced for a long time in the 50s, and eventually they ended up both racing for Ferrari at the same time. And they were genuine gods of the racetracks back then. I mean, there's a couple of stories. I suppose the standout one about Peter Collins, when he first joined Ferrari, Enzo Ferrari, who ran Ferrari, started the Ferrari team, and was the head of Ferrari for a long time, was a fearsome character. But he loved his son a great deal, and his son died very young, an untimely death when he was only in his 30s. He may have even been younger than that. I don't recall. And Peter Collins was a young driver at the time who came and started driving for Ferrari, and Enzo kind of took him on as a surrogate son almost, shortly after his son Dino had died. And in that first, maybe the second season, 56 or 57, just to give you a measure of the man, right? He was a British driver driving for Ferrari, driving at the Italian Grand Prix. So it doesn't get any bigger for a Ferrari driver than driving for Ferrari in Italy. And he was about to become, or had a real chance to become, the very first British world champion in Formula One. And late on in the race, his team leader, Juan Manuel Fangio, who was the undisputed greatest driver of the era, he was his teammate at Ferrari and his team leader. He had a problem with his car late on in the race. And Peter Collins, who was going to go on and win the championship to be the first ever British driver, pulled into the pits and handed his car over to Fangio. So Fangio got in his car and went on to win the race. And Fangio said he was the greatest gentleman he ever knew in racing. But that's the sort of measure of who Peter Collins was, right? And that's what I love about reading about these drivers of the 50s and 60s, that's the kind of people they were. They were enormously brave, but they were also generally huge sportsmen who had great honor. Peter Collins, unfortunately, died at the German Grand Prix in 58. Mike Hawthorne, his great friend, his Mon Ami Mate, went on to be world champion that year, and then died in a car crash on the roads just in January following. He actually retired from racing because his friend Peter had died at the Nürburgring. He went on to become world champion and then quit and died a few months later, 3 months later, I think. So that's one great book, probably of all my motor racing books. That's my favorite. And then there's a quirky book that sticks with me. I really don't know why this is the case. It's a book about soccer, about football. It's about Coventry City in the English Premier League as it was then, as they were then, and they've been relegated since then. And I think at the time, in 97, 98, them, Arsenal and Everton are the only teams who had ever stayed in the top division their entire career. But this book is written by an American, Grikowski, I think his name is. He's an American academic, actually, but a great fan of Coventry City. And somehow he managed to persuade Coventry City to give him complete access for a whole season. So he went in the dressing room, he spoke to the directors, he talked to the fans, he went to the games, and he wrote a book about this. And it's called Staying Up. And the reason it's called Staying Up, as long listeners of the podcast will know, as Ian has talked about before, in English Football League, if you're at the bottom of the league, your division, at the end of the season, you go down. And if you're in the top of the division below, you come up. So staying up is all about just managing to stay out of the relegation zone, to stay in that league and not go down. And Coventry were perennial bottom of the table kind of team. So he called his book Staying Up because that's what the whole season was about, really trying to survive. And I think at the end of this season, Gordon Strachan, who was the manager of Coventry City, said I don't know the exact quote, but said something to the effect of, if I'd known what kind of book you were going to write, I would never have given you access to myself and the rest of the team. But having read the book, I'm really glad I did.
Really?
So yeah, and it's a great book. It's literally, I guess it only really appeals to Coventry City fans and me, because I'm not a Coventry City fan. But it's just such a fascinating look behind the scenes of what it's like to be a mid-table kind of nothingy kind of team, doing your best, scratching around, trying to make sure you stay out of relegation. And the whole drama of what goes on in transfers and what goes on between the tussles between the players and the manager and the players and all of that. And the one thing that sticks with me, and this is one of the reasons I love the book, was that somewhere in the book, and it may have been a recurring theme, but it's the one thing I really remember, was how the writer said, a sports team really only belongs to the fans, because players come and go, managers come and go, coaches come and go, even owners come and go. The only people who stay from like cradle to grave, Kevin, you're one, right, for the Leafs. Yeah. Ian, you're the same with the Habs. The only people who stay cradle to grave are the fans. Everybody else is transient, but the fans aren't. So a team really belongs to the fans. And I love that whole notion of that. Anyway, that's one of my favorite books.
Yeah. And that's incredible. I beside me are a whole. I was trying to decide on what my favorite books are and to talk about them. And as I was going through my library of books here, and I realized that thankfully I have obviously a lot of hockey books, and they're all Kevin's books, and a few that belong to Craig McGinnis. But I also have basketball books, I have golf books, and I have boxing books. And I bring up boxing because one of my favorite books of all time, and I call favorite books the ones that I've read more than twice, is called The Fight, and it's written by Norman Mailer. And it's one of those things where, there are great writers out there that have written books that are outside of what you might expect. And I think that Mailer writing a book called The Fight isn't totally unexpected because of the kind of character that he is. But it's actually, I didn't actually check to see how many pages. It's 233 pages of his perspective on the Muhammad Ali George Foreman fight in Zaire.
Yeah.
And a lot of behind the scenes stories, but it's just written in that tough way that Mailer writes, and it's really quite something. Tim, you're aware of this book too?
No, I am, but it's funny because if we'd been talking about movies, my favorite sports movie is When We Were Kings, which is basically the documentary around that. And Norman Mailer is a key character in the movie.
Absolutely.
Talking about writing that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So the other book that I pulled out 6, and I'm going to talk about 2, and The Fight is the first, and the second is this book called To the Lynx Land. And it's a golf book, granted. It's written by Michael Bamberger, who's a Sports Illustrated writer. And in 1991, he took a year off from writing with the permission of his wife to go over to Europe to be a professional tour caddy. And he wasn't working for anyone in particular. He was basically, he wanted to go to all the great links golf courses in Europe. And this was his way of getting to them all, was by being a caddy. And it's wonderfully written, really super entertaining, because at the end of the day, any book that you read needs to be entertaining.
Yep.
And it talks about, how difficult it is to be a journeyman caddy, but even more so a journeyman golfer. We all know professionals at certain levels, and we know the difference between those that make it and those that don't, whether they're sports figures or musicians or whatnot. And it's a razor thin edge from one side to the other. And I think that that's another thing that I find fascinating when I read these books, is I think that we have a tendency to read about people that we think are remarkable. And as we read their stories, we realize they're not remarkable until they do something remarkable.
Yeah. Steve, can I just ask, so it sounds like it's a very similar theme to a guy named George Plimpton, who put a number
Absolutely.
of books out in the late 50s through the 60s into the 70s. And he did a number of things. He was a quarterback for the Detroit Lions in a book called Paper Lion, having no real athletic ability. Another book called Open Net, he became a goalie for the Boston Bruins during an exhibition game. Again, had never skated or had skated very poorly before that. But anyway, he did a series of books like that, and it was wonderful to get his perspective on what it's like to be on the team, in the dressing room, preparing what happens on the actual field or ice or whatever it happens to be too. Sounds very similar to some of my favorite books as well.
Yeah. And, I think this is certainly more along Kim's line, but the third book that I would recommend to anybody that hasn't already read it, and I can't imagine anybody that hasn't read it, is Moneyball, which is an incredible tale of what the business of baseball is behind the scenes, especially when somebody sees something that nobody else in the game does.
Yeah, I think those kind of behind the scenes things, even things like, is it Draft Day? I think that the one about the NFL with I can't remember his name, useless at actors' names, but yeah, Draft Day. It's all about who you're going to pick as your first pick in the draft, and the trading that goes on all day, to swap out the picks and the players and all that sort of thing. And it's probably somewhat like real life, and probably somewhat not like real life, but that whole kind of idea of getting a look behind the scenes of what really goes on that the rest of us don't get to see most of the time. I mean, that's the same thing with staying up, even though it's only about a small Coventry fans insignificant team. It's that same thing. You're getting a peek behind the curtain.
Kim, I'm curious, what kind of writing do you prefer? Do you prefer reading columnists, or do you prefer books on baseball?
Both, actually. I subscribe to a few paid baseball sites, and I enjoy them a great deal. I've got a respectable baseball library, and thank you very much for bringing up Moneyball. I was trying to decide if there was one that I really preferred, and I didn't come up with one, actually. But when you mentioned Moneyball, I was kind of kicking myself, because you're right, that was a fantastic book, and really told the story of a remarkable era in the life of the Oakland A's team. But I did have a thought, if I may offer it. I went slightly askew, and I was thinking about baseball films, and I wanted to salute one and diss another. And I'll start with the diss first. I actually like most of Field of Dreams. It is a bit sappy, but I will always never feel right about the fact that they had the actor Ray Liotta play Shoeless Joe Jackson as a right-handed batter when he was a left-handed batter. This is absolute freaking sacrilege. I was stunned when I saw this. It ruined the whole movie for me. I kid you not. On the other side of the coin, how could you not love Bull Durham? Oh my God, Kevin Costner was so good as the washed up player, hanging on by his fingernails, and how about Susan Sarandon and Gina Davis? They were both tremendous. Love that movie. Just that's my favorite baseball movie.
Nice.
I have to say that whenever I watch Field of Dreams, I sob like a baby thinking about my own situation. I can watch it 100 times, and 100 times I'll sob. It hits me right in the feels. That's for sure.
Well, I hope I ruined it for you, Kev.
No, in fact, I'll watch it as soon as we take this podcast offline. There we go.
When I was a teenager, I sat through multiple viewings of Rollerball.
Oh God.
Wow.
Anyway, well, let's wrap this up. Whether it's a book or a movie, let's go around the horn, as they say, and one recommendation. Ian, you start.
Oh God. I'd say Final Rounds, but the father and son, the golf journey of a lifetime. It's the sappy but lovely story. Maybe it just caught me at that moment because, just it's got a great story to a great arc to the story. It's not just rehashing a championship. It's just a lovely story. Just happens to be about golf.
Kev?
Well, I mentioned the book, The Sweater by Rock Carrier, but as far as films, and because I'm such a hockey guy, I relish a hockey film. And as much as I've seen them all, I've never seen a good hockey movie. I've been entertained by most of them, but I've never seen a good one because actors can't skate and hockey players can't act, and never the twins shall meet, or very seldom.
They act all the time, getting those cheap calls.
Well, maybe so, but yeah. So I mean, I've seen so many, but there's none that I would recommend as a favorite. But when they come on, or if I have some late watching to do, there's nothing wrong with throwing a movie on. I'm just going to go back to a book, but also it's a TV. It's a really cheesy TV film. But I'm going to ask Tim, did you ever read or did you ever see The Art of Racing in the Rain by any chance?
Yeah, I read the book. Yeah.
Did you? Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the book. I didn't love the film so much, but another one that gets me right where it counts.
All right. Tim, what's your recommendation?
I think I would say movie, and I would say that it's Rush, the movie about the 76 season with Niki Lauda and the British guy whose name escapes me. Yeah, but it's a great movie. It's not really true to life, but it captures the visceral nature of what racing is really all about, especially back then in the 70s. Right? I knew the story inside and out, of course, because I can't help it because it's racing. And knowing that the big, it's a slight spoiler, but knowing that the big accident was coming, I could barely breathe watching the movie, knowing it was coming, just waiting for that moment. And it is absolutely a stunning, scary, horrific bit of film, actually. Yeah, it's great to watch. Rush.
Kimmer?
I'm going to go with Moneyball, and just reflecting on the moment in the book when the A's out of nowhere won 20 straight games. It was just absolute magic.
Nice. And I had you guys talk first because I was straining my brain for what is it that I would recommend. But at the end of the day, I'm going to recommend To the Lynx Land because it's a book that most people don't know about. It's wonderfully written. Whether you like golf or not, I think it's a grand story that a lot of people will enjoy because it really is something about someone fulfilling a dream and taking you along for the ride of fulfilling that dream. So that was a great episode, guys. So this would be a good time for me to end it by saying, well, that's it for this episode. If you made it this far, you deserve a Clark bar. If you like what you heard, please share the podcast with your friends. And if you rate, review, or subscribe, we might get a few more listeners on board. If you've made it through any or all of our episodes, well, you're now a new athletic supporter too. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye, folks.